World War II, 1939 to 1945, was the largest conflict in human history, involving 61 countries with a population of 1.7 billion people, or 80% of the world's population. Fighting spread across 40 countries and resulted in enormous losses among the civilian population. The origins of the conflict, according to consensus among researchers, date back to 1918 to 1919 and the series of treaties that ended World War I. In this sense, the Treaty of Versailles deserves special attention, as it inflicted serious damage on Germany's military, political, and economic situation. Not only did the country lose significant territories and all its colonial possessions, the ability to maintain an army of adequate size and technical specifications, and forced to pay substantial reparations to the victorious powers, reparations that, incidentally, were considered excessive within Germany itself, but it was also held primarily responsible for the conflict. It is not surprising that this type of peace became fertile ground for the growth of revanchist sentiments in the Weimar Republic. However, the Versailles system had another significant flaw. Although it guaranteed the borders of the Western states, it ignored the corresponding issue in the East. Thus, after the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in July 1919, Polish troops expelled the Ukrainian National Armed Forces from all of eastern Galicia, formerly part of Austria-Hungary. However, there was no reaction. Moreover, Pilsudski's largest military action, the March on Kiev, was carried out with the support of the French armed forces. The conclusion of the Treaty of Rapallo on April 16, 1922, demonstrated that the Versailles system, which essentially divided states into elected and exiled, offered a positive alternative: the coexistence of states and peoples who determined their own way of life without external interference. The flaws in the Versailles-Washington system were consolidated by the Locarno Treaties of October 5 to 16, 1925, signed by Germany, France, England, Italy, Belgium, Poland, and Czechoslovakia, which legalized the borders of Western European states. The USSR's demands for an Eastern Locarno were rejected, and Moscow was forced to resolve the border issue through bilateral agreements. A hotbed of militarism was also brewing on the other side of the world. Since the mid-19th century, rapidly developing Japan had been actively competing for markets and raw materials in the Pacific and the Far East. The Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895 and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905 were steps along this path. In 1927, Japanese Prime Minister and Minister of the Interior General Tanaka Gichi developed a program of expansion and struggle for global domination, the so-called Tanaka Memorandum. To conquer China, we must first conquer Manchuria and Mongolia. To conquer the world, we must first conquer China. If we succeed in conquering China, all other Asian countries and the countries of the South Pacific will fear us and surrender to us. With all of China's resources at our disposal, we will proceed to conquer India, the archipelago, Central Asia, and even Europe. But taking control of Manchuria and Mongolia is the first step. This plan also made a confrontation with the USSR inevitable. The Soviet leadership became aware of the text of the memorandum in 1928, along with documentary evidence of parallel joint British actions to take Xinjiang from China and turn it into a springboard for the fight against the Soviet Union. Today, scholars are not entirely certain of the authenticity of the memorandum. In any case, Japan has been denying it since 1929. However, the course of events in the Far East in the 1930s and 1940s was entirely consistent with the logic of this document. In In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria and established the puppet state of Manchukuo. This was an act of aggression against a member state of the League of Nations and, moreover, the first attempt to implement a blitzkrieg strategy. But the aggressor went unpunished, which paved the way for international permissiveness and arbitrariness. In response to appeals from China and the USSR to the League of Nations Council requesting sanctions against Japan, the Sino-Japanese conflict was removed from the jurisdiction of the League and transferred to a special conference of countries interested in the situation in the Far East. Its work dragged on until September 1945, due to the fact that some of the member states felt unable to distinguish between the aggressor and the victim of aggression, or to sympathize with the victim on any grounds. Ultimately, Japanese aggression cost China 38 million lives. For a long time, these victims were not counted in the total number of casualties of World War II. In fact, it was the lack of response to Japanese aggression that drew a dividing line between the relatively peaceful post-war period, culminating in the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which renounced war as a means of foreign policy, and the turbulent period of humanity's descent into the bloodiest conflict in its history. In 1933, the National Socialist Workers' Party came to power in Germany, already openly expressing its nationalist plans. That same year, it became part of the so-called Four-Power Pact, which stipulated the establishment of a directory on the continent composed of England, France, Germany, and Italy. The others, including the USSR, were relegated to the role of extras or objects of politics. Thus, Hitler was inserted into the circle of the leaders of the great powers. Although the pact was never fully ratified, it undoubtedly marked the beginning of a policy of appeasement on the part of European states, which did not condemn the illegal actions of Nazi Germany, but only tried to frame them in a structure acceptable to the great powers. In essence, the Pact of Four became the prologue to Munich. From the moment the pact was concluded, the strategy best expressed by Lord Lloyd came into effect. We will give Japan carte blanche against the USSR. We will let it expand the Korean-Manchurian border to the Arctic Ocean and annex the eastern part of Siberia. We will open the way eastward for Germany and thus provide it with the expansion it so badly needs. Essentially, this foresaw the encirclement and liquidation of the Soviet state. In these circumstances, the USSR's initiative to sign the Convention on the Defining Aggressor and creating a collective security system is not surprising. In August 1933, it signed treaties defining an aggressor with Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Turkey, Iran, and Afghanistan. Finland joined the convention in 1934. In September 1933, a treaty of non-aggression and neutrality was concluded between the USSR and Italy. On December 20, 1933, at a meeting of the Politburo of the Central Committee, a plan drawn up by the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs for the creation of a collective security system was considered. This plan provided for the possibility of the USSR joining the League of Nations, which meant at the same time a rejection of the tactic of fostering world revolution and a focus on the struggle to maintain peace on the European continent. On September 17, 1934, the Soviet Union was admitted to the League of Nations. The Soviet Union's subsequent peace initiatives included a proposal to conclude the Eastern and Pacific Pacts. In addition to the Soviet Union, the Eastern Pact was to include Germany, Poland, Finland, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Under the Eastern Pact, each participating country could count on military assistance in the event of aggression, specifically military aggression by a third power. Of course, this pact was intended primarily to prevent German military aggression and the outbreak of a global conflict by Germany. The Pacific Pact was to include, in addition to the Soviet Union, the United States, England, the Netherlands, and Japan. But both of these initiatives by the Soviet Union were rejected. In the spring of 1935, the Soviet Union managed to sign mutual assistance pacts in the event of aggression only with France and Czechoslovakia. At the same time, both countries concluded a mutual assistance treaty between themselves. The peacekeeping efforts of the Soviet Union were also reflected in the work of the Communist International, whose 7th Congress was held in Moscow in July and August 1935. At that Congress, a decision was made to establish a united popular anti-fascist front. This initiative took on particular relevance in the context of the deteriorating military and political situation on the European continent. In 1935, Nazi Germany violated the provisions of the Treaty of Versailles. It introduced compulsory military service and announced the creation of a military air force. In June 1935, Great Britain and Germany concluded a naval agreement that allowed Germany, contrary to the Treaty of Versailles, to maintain a navy equivalent to 1/3 of the surface ships and almost half of the submarines of the British fleet. Germany justified this measure by the need to control the Baltic Sea basin, and Britain, in practice, recognized the Baltic as a German sphere of influence. On October 3, 1934, Italy invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia, and occupied it in early May of the following year. On May 9, 1936, the Italian Empire was proclaimed in Rome. Of the great powers, only the USSR, which had no diplomatic relations with Abyssinia, came out resolutely in its defense. However, the Western powers blocked Soviet proposals to boycott the aggressor. They believed that opposing Italian fascism could lead to the rise of a communist government in Italy and a radical change in the balance of power in Europe. On March 7, 1936, Nazi Germany, in violation of the 1925 Locarno agreements, sent troops to the demilitarized Rhineland and reached the borders of France. France did not exercise its right provided for in the Treaty of Versailles to force Germany to withdraw its troops. In September 1936, the Nazi Party Congress, held in Nuremberg, announced a 4-year plan to prepare Germany for a major war to secure living space or Lebensraum for the German people. On January 30, 1937, Hitler announced that Germany was withdrawing its signature from the Treaty of Versailles. After this declaration, a new war in Europe became inevitable. On October 25, 1936, the Berlin Agreement formalized the alliance between Germany and Italy, known as the Berlin-Rome Axis. The parties recognized each other's territorial gains, established a common line of conduct regarding events in Spain, and agreed to delimit spheres of economic penetration in the Balkans and the Danube River basin. The formation of the Axis marked the beginning of the formation of the bloc of fascist aggressors preparing for World War II. This policy was continued with the signing of the Anti-Comintern Pact by Germany and Japan on November 25, 1936. The parties to this agreement undertook to inform each other about the activities of the revolutionary proletarian organization and to coordinate their struggle against it. Other states were advised to take defensive measures in the spirit of the agreement or to join the pact. The pact was aimed at the USSR, where the Comintern headquarters was located. in 1937, fascist Italy joined the pact. The first confrontation between the USSR and the Axis powers took place in Spain, where the Popular Front government, created on the initiative of the Communist Party, came to power in February 1936. In July of that year, a fascist military rebellion broke out in the country, led by General Francisco Franco, who had the support of the Spanish Falange, a right-wing Spanish political party founded in 1933, and most of the army, up to 100,000 men. The League of Nations rejected the Republican government's demand for collective action against the aggressors. Germany and Italy sent military equipment, weapons, officers, and military instructors to support Franco's supporters. When this proved insufficient, regular troops began to arrive, more than 50,000 from Germany, the Condor Legion, and about 200,000 from Italy. The legal basis for the emergence of these nominally volunteer interventionist troops was the recognition of Franco's regime by Germany and Italy on November 18, 1937. In the ensuing civil war, Spanish Republicans received assistance from communists and socialists from many countries. About 3,000 Soviet volunteers, military advisors, pilots, tank crews, sailors, and other specialists fought against the Phalangists in the ranks of the international brigades, which included more than 50,000 men from 64 countries. England, France, and other Western powers pursued a policy of non-intervention in the National Revolutionary War. Since September 1936, the International Committee for Non-Intervention in Spanish Affairs, composed of representatives from 27 European countries, had been operating in London. However, as soon became evident, it had in practice become a front for Italian-German intervention in Spain. The Soviet representative on the committee, Maisky, fought to prevent aid to the rebels from Germany, Italy, and Portugal, aid that had been provided with the complicity of England and France and the de facto connivance of the United States. In October 1936, the Soviet government declared that, since the non-intervention agreement had effectively ceased to exist, it considered it necessary to restore to the Spanish government the right and possibility of acquiring arms outside Spain. Thanks to the efforts of the Soviet Union, an agreement on measures to combat submarine piracy by the fascist powers was concluded in September 1937. However, the policy of complicity with aggression prevented the Non-Intervention Committee from becoming an effective political instrument. This, to a large extent, predetermined the fall of Republican Spain. Strengthening its position in the Far East, the USSR concluded a mutual assistance treaty with the People's Republic of Mongolia in March 1936. This served as a warning to Japanese militarists. However, on July 7, 1937, Japan invaded China, occupied its northern regions, and captured Shanghai, Beijing, and other important centers. In response, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with China on August 21, 1937, granting it a large loan on preferential terms and supplying aircraft, weapons, and fuel. With no opposition from Britain, the United States, or France, Hitler occupied Austria on March 12, 1938, and proclaimed its annexation to Germany. On April 16th, British Prime Minister Chamberlain signed an agreement with the head of the Italian fascist government, Mussolini. The agreement contained Italy's commitment to withdraw its volunteers from Spain, but only after the end of the Civil War. Thus, the British government tacitly consented to the participation of Italian troops in the fight alongside Franco. On March 28, 1939, Madrid fell. A fascist dictatorship was established in the country. Franco became head of state, immediately joining the anti-Comintern Pact. At the end of September 1938, Britain and Germany adopted a declaration promising never to wage war against each other. On December 6th, France and Germany signed a similar non-aggression declaration. French Foreign Minister Bonnet believed that, from that moment on, German policy was oriented towards the fight against Bolshevism. On September 29, 1938, at the Munich negotiations, Germany obtained the consent of Great Britain and France to annex the Sudetenland, a region populated mainly by Germans from Czechoslovakia. In March 1939, with the consent of the Czechoslovak president Gacha, Germany occupied the entire territory of that country. On March 16th, Hitler's decree divided Czechoslovakia into the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, incorporated into the Third Reich, and Slovakia, which effectively became a complete vassal of Germany. The importance of Germany's absorption of Czechoslovakia is difficult to overestimate. Czechoslovakia served as a link between the Western and Eastern security systems. Unique among the small and medium-sized countries in the region, it had significant defense potential and a developed military industry. The country's strategic location was also important. Overcoming this barrier, combined with the Anschluss of Austria, facilitated German penetration into Eastern, Southern, and Southeastern Europe, giving it access to the Black and Mediterranean Seas. Knowing full well that the Nazis were preparing to take Czechoslovakia, the United States, Britain, and France were in a privileged position to determine an appropriate countermeasure. But in November 1937, England and France agreed to cede Czechoslovakia to Hitler if the annexation of the Sudetenland took place without unnecessary fuss. The Soviet Union was the only country willing not only to fulfill its alliance obligations to Czechoslovakia, but also to take decisive action. On September 28, 1938, the Soviet leadership planned to send 500 aircraft to assist Czechoslovakia. On September 29th, an order was issued to place the air, tank, and infantry units of the Western military districts on combat alert for 2 days. However, Anglo-French pressure on Czechoslovakia nullified all Soviet efforts. The country was forced to refuse the USSR's help. In addition, Poland and Romania declared their unwillingness to allow Soviet troops to pass through their territories. Yet their own crises were soon to follow. After Germany effectively annexed the Lithuanian port of Memel on March 22, 1939, coercing Lithuania into a treaty that formally ceded the port, a German-Romanian economic agreement was signed on March 23rd. Under its terms, the Romanian government committed to increasing oil production and refining capacity for transfer to Nazi Germany. Concurrently, Germany presented territorial demands to Poland, insisting on the cession of the city of Danzig, Gdansk. Poland lawfully rejected these demands. In response, Adolf Hitler unilaterally abrogated the German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact, which had been in force since 1934. In April 1939, Germans ally Italy occupied Albania. This escalation by the aggressor was fueled by the expansion of the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was joined by Hungary and the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo in February 1939, and by Spain the following month. On September 27, 1940, it was transformed into an open military alliance, the Berlin Pact. In November 1941, the pact was extended for 5 years. At that time, Bulgaria, Finland, Romania, Denmark, and the governments of Slovakia, Croatia, and Japanese-controlled government of China in Nanjing also joined. This completed the formation of the aggressive bloc of fascist states and their satellites that had been developing since the mid-1930s. Along with the deterioration of the political situation in Europe, the situation in the Far East was worsening. After occupying northern China, militaristic Japan continued its war to conquer the entire country in 1938. In July 1938, Japanese troops invaded Soviet territory in Primorie, near Lake Kazan, and in May 1939, they attacked Mongolia near the Khalkhin-Gol River. Having eliminated the threat within its own borders, the Soviet Union, in accordance with the USSR-Mongolia Mutual Assistance Pact, came to the aid of its ally. Essentially, Great Britain was one of the parties involved in the conflict in the Far East. On the one hand, it exerted pressure on Soviet-Japanese tensions, while on the other, it tolerated Japan's actions in China. The latter position was enshrined in the Anglo-Japanese Agreement of July 1939, which quickly became known as the Far Eastern Munich. In August 1939, Soviet-Mongolian forces under the command of Zhukov defeated the Japanese invaders. The Moscow Agreement between the USSR, Mongolia, and Japan on September 15, 1939 marked the end of the conflict. The USSR could not remain indifferent to the Chinese people's struggle for national independence. From the fall of 1937 until early 1942, when Soviet advisors and specialists had already largely left China, more than 5,000 Soviet citizens worked and fought in the rear and on the front lines of the anti-Japanese struggle. During those years, the USSR supplied China with 1,285 aircraft, 1,600 artillery pieces, 82 tanks, 1,850 tractors, a large number of machine guns, rifles, ammunition, communications equipment, and medical equipment. The USSR did not abandon hope of reaching constructive agreements to maintain peace in Europe. On April 17, 1939, the Soviet side proposed the conclusion of a mutual assistance treaty and a military convention with England and France. Hitler, who had already decided to prepare for war with Poland, sought to prevent an Anglo-French-Soviet treaty and proposed that the Western powers rehabilitate the ideas of the Four-Power Pact. De jure, the British and French governments opted for negotiations with the USSR. De facto, they tried to counteract the rapprochement between the USSR and Germany. On the Soviet side, this could be facilitated by the incomplete rearmament of the army and the absence of a collective security treaty in Europe. On the German side, by the insufficient resource base of the conquered European countries in a context of rapid Nazi expansion. The British and French military missions that arrived in Moscow on August 12th were composed of second-tier personnel with no authority to sign diplomatic agreements. During the negotiations, the Soviet side presented a plan it had developed for joint action by the armed forces of the three countries in all possible cases of aggression in Europe. The Polish government, contacted in this regard, refused the offer to allow Soviet troops to pass through its territory in the event of a German attack. The negotiations reached an impasse, regretting the missed opportunities former French Prime Minister Reynaud declared in 1947. With whom should we have formed an alliance? Common sense, geography, history, and Hitler's plans provided us with a clear answer to that question. When Hitler announced his intention to settle accounts with France and then dismember Russia, he, one might say, single-handedly propelled our countries towards an alliance. But was this alliance so obviously necessary denied to us? No, it was offered to us, but we ourselves rejected it. The failure of the Anglo-Franco-Soviet negotiations in Moscow in August 1939 contributed to the outbreak of World War II initiated by Germany. While Anglo-Franco-Soviet negotiations had reached an impasse and numerous Soviet proposals for collective security in Europe had been rejected, Germany approached the USSR with a proposal to resume the political line that had been beneficial to both countries over the past centuries. German diplomats were instructed to stage a new Rapallo phase in German-Russian relations as early as mid-April. When examining the events surrounding the conclusion of the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact, it is rarely remembered that May to August 1939 marked the height of the fighting at Halkin Gol, where total casualties were comparable to the number of dead and wounded during the Nazi conquest of France in 1940. Thus, at the height of the battle at Halkin Gol, with a more than uncertain prognosis, and at the time of the Anglo-Franco-Soviet negotiations, London officially supported Japan's expansionist policy. The Arita-Craigie Agreement stated that the British government fully recognizes the current situation in China, where large-scale military operations are taking place, and considers that, as long as this situation persists, the Japanese armed forces in China have special needs for their own security and for the maintenance of public order in the areas under their control. The lack of an official reaction from London to the invasion of the People's Republic of Mongolia led to pessimistic speculation on the part of the Soviet Union about Britain's desire to provoke Germany into attacking the USSR, which was vulnerable in a state of war on two fronts. In addition, it became widely known that Wilson, advisor to British Prime Minister, and Hudson, Secretary for Overseas Trade, had negotiated with Voltad, a Nazi officer, on a special mission in July 1939. Voltad received documents outlining a program of broad cooperation on political, military, and economic matters, which, according to Wilson, had been approved by the British Prime Minister himself. In addition, the British assured the Reich that during negotiations with the USSR, they were only interested in obtaining information about the combat capabilities of the Soviet armed forces. From the end of July 1939, German inquiries about the possibility of reaching a political agreement with the USSR intensified. Furthermore, on August 7th, the Soviet leadership learned of Germany's plans to launch military action against Poland on August 25th. War was approaching, and the position of Great Britain and France in negotiations with the USSR remained unchanged. The USSR could not ignore the fact that, according to the Weiss Plan, Fall Weiss, the Reich planned to establish control over Lithuania and Latvia up to the borders of former Courland, simultaneously or immediately after Poland. This also led the USSR to attempt to postpone the start of the war with Germany through political agreement. On August 23, 1939, after 3 hours of negotiations in Moscow, the Soviet-German Non-Aggression Pact, known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, was signed for a period of 10 years. The secret protocol that accompanied it defined the delimitation of the two countries' spheres of influence in Europe. Of particular importance were the provisions of the protocol that established that in the event of a territorial and political rearrangement in the areas belonging to the Baltic states, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the northern boundary of Lithuania shall represent the boundary of the spheres of influence of Germany and the USSR. In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Polish state, the spheres of influence of Germany and the USSR shall be bounded approximately by the lines of the rivers Narew, Vistula, and San. With regard to southeastern Europe, attention is called by the Soviet side to its interest in Bessarabia. The German side declares its complete political disinterest in these areas. This meant that, in the event of a war, German troops would not invade Latvia, Estonia, Finland, and Bessarabia, and would not advance beyond the aforementioned rivers in Poland. It is worth remembering that the pact was signed after Germany had approved the decision to launch a military attack on Poland, and therefore had no impact on the events of September 1, 1939. Furthermore, the USSR did not respond to German demands to send its troops to the areas of the theater of war assigned to it by the secret protocol. Only on September 17th did 4 army groups from the Belarusian front and 3 groups from the Ukrainian front cross the western border of the state to protect the Ukrainian and Belarusian populations from the impending war amid the disorganization of the Polish state. Interestingly, under these circumstances, the United States refused to classify the USSR's actions as an act of war. The choice of the pact with Germany was dictated by the USSR's desire to gain time to strengthen its defenses. In addition, this agreement contributed to a split within the fascist bloc. For example, on August 25, 1939, the Japanese government decided to abandon its policy of strengthening the anti-Comintern axis. The Cabinet of Ministers, headed by Hiranuma, an advocate of the Japanese-German anti-Soviet line against the USSR, resigned on August 28. On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland. On September 3rd, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany. World War II had begun. The Polish army was unable to resist the aggressor and began to retreat. Seeking to secure its borders in the Far East, the Soviet leadership signed a neutrality treaty with Japan in the spring of 1941. Having occupied northern Indochina, Japan was expanding southward and did not want to be prematurely drawn into a war with the USSR due to its alliance obligations to Germany. The 5-year Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact was signed on April 13th after difficult negotiations with Japanese Foreign Minister Matsuoka. Germany, which had been at war with Britain and France since September 1939, buoyed by its rapid success in Poland, concentrated on expanding its living space at the expense of the Western countries. On April 9, 1940, Nazi troops invaded Denmark and Norway, and on May 10th, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Then, as a result of the Blitzkrieg, they defeated France, which capitulated on June 24th. Italy entered the war on Germany's side on June 10th. German losses, 27,000 killed in the campaign against France, were, according to German estimates, quite tolerable, considering the enormity of the success achieved. The economies of the occupied countries were put at the service of the Reich, significantly strengthening Germany's military and political potential. However, Germany's resources proved insufficient to successfully conclude the war against England. Hitler decided to increase them by defeating the USSR, which would pave the way for domination over all of Europe. On July 1940, the German General Staff began to develop a specific war plan against the USSR, and on December 18, 1940, Hitler approved a directive ordering the armed forces to defeat Soviet Russia in a short campaign before the conclusion of the war against England, Operation Barbarossa. According to optimistic forecasts, the campaign could be successfully completed in 1.5 to 2 months, according to more cautious forecasts, in 4 to 5 months. In any case, the war was planned to end in 1941 before the onset of winter. The Nazis counted on the destruction of the USSR and the drastic reduction of its population through military action, starvation, and forced deportation east of the Astrakhan-Volga-Arkhangelsk line. The Nazis hoped that resistance to the invasion could be weakened by promoting the slogan of liberating the Soviet people from the oppressive and alien Bolshevik regime. However, this scenario did not materialize. Thus, the prologue to World War II was the imperfection of the Versailles-Washington system of international relations and the policy of appeasement of the aggressors by Western countries, which hoped that the open aggression of Germany and Japan would not extend beyond the borders of Eastern Europe and the Asian region.